these roots. Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. Today we have a special guest, Ms. Tamara Lanier, where she's going to talk about her book, From These Roots. But before we begin, let's talk about the Connecticut Freedom Trail. It was established in August of 1995 by the General Assembly to tell the stories of Black narratives and the contributions of the Black and African American communities to Connecticut as well as the nation. It would open a year later, September 1996, in 65 towns with 30 sites. Today, we are upwards of 180 sites in 70 towns, still with the same mission to tell the story of the contributions of the Black and African American communities. Today, we are going to talk to Ms. Tamara Lanier, a Connecticut native, Connecticut's very own, and she is going to talk about legacy and what it means to not just her, but to the communities at large. Ms. Tamara K. Lanier is a tireless champion for truth and justice, whose advocacy has taken her across Connecticut, the nation, and the globe. A 27-year veteran of the state of Connecticut Judicial Branch, Ms. Lanier retired in 2017 as Chief Probation Officer II in the Norwich Probation Office. She has a long and distinguished record of public service and social advocacy. Recently, she was appointed by Governor Ned Lamont to Connecticut's first hate crime adversary council. Recognized for her dedication to justice, Ms. Lanier was named Woman of the Year in 2015 by the Connecticut General Assembly's Commission on African American Affairs. In 2016, she received the Connecticut Commission of Human Rights and Opportunities Leaders and Legends Award and was honored with the Inspirational Women's Award in 2019. Ms. Lanier has passionately advocated for a national dialogue on slavery's enduring impact on society. Her advocacy has led to meetings with such dignitaries as Congressman John Lewis and John Conyers, where the need for federal legislation to protect the cultural relics of slavery was discussed. With the support of nationally acclaimed civil rights attorneys Benjamin L. Crump and the late Michael Koskoff, Ms. Lanier filed a landmark reparations lawsuit against Harvard University, challenging their ownership of her enslaved ancestors' images and forcing the nation to reckon with this legacy of slavery. Ms. Lanier is also an accomplished writer. Her memoir, From These Roots, has drawn praise from scholars, historians, and activists for its riveting account of her battle for justice. From These Roots is more than a personal story. It is a call to confront the enduring afterlife of slavery and America's unfinished business of reparative justice. Through this powerful work, Ms. Tamara Lanier invites readers to grapple with history, stand against injustice, and honor the legacies of those who came before us. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Tamara K. Lanier.
Thank you. Thank you for that amazing welcome.
You are so welcome. Thank you for being here. Please feel free to just jump right into your presentation. And on the other side, we will have questions and answer or just a more in-depth conversation. So please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. So, what we see on the screen before us now is a copy of the book. It's titled From These Roots, is actually a title of a book that was written by my daughter when she was in fourth grade. And that was one of the reasons why I embraced this title, so that I can make it a family collaborative. And the next screen, if we can move is an image of my mother. And my mother, I like to refer to her as the keeper of our family story. She was the daughter of sharecropper parents. She was born in a small rural community of Mount Meigs, Montgomery, Alabama. And she grew up with her extended family, and also a part of that extended family is her grandfather, who was born a slave, who was named Renty after the man in the image. And he told my mom these amazing stories about her African born ancestor, who was the first African to set foot on American soil, her first ancestor. And he would tell her amazing stories about her ancestors, but specifically about Papa Renty. And she would always be reminded to never forget and to share the story of our ancestors. The next slide. I have here an image of a man. His name is Rich Morrison. Rich Morrison is an ice cream shop, or was an ice cream shop owner in Norwich, Connecticut. And he was an amazing researcher. He was a business owner. His profession, he lived in Lebanon, Connecticut. He had a farm. But Rich also liked to do genealogy and genealogical research. So what I'd like to do for those who aren't familiar with the story is offer a little background, a little of the backstory. As I explained about my mom, she grew up with her extended family. My mom, throughout her childhood, heard stories about her ancestors who came before them, starting always with Papa Renty and who he was. It was told to her that he was a proud Black African, that he was a learned person. He was self-taught. He taught himself to read using Noah Webster's Blueback Speller. And he also, an enslaved man, would teach others to read at his own peril when he knew that this was at risk to himself and his family, for him to teach others to read. But my mother heard all of these amazing stories of this community man, this beloved man, Papa Renty. And she heard it from his children, who would say to her, always remember it and never forget these things. And so my mother, when we were small, as far back as I can remember, I remember my mom telling me these stories about Papa Renty, about the elders, about growing up in the Jim Crow South, about growing up in the cradle of what she referred to as the civil rights movement, the cradle of the civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama. And so she would tell us these things, and she would often, just as it was told to her, say, always remember and never forget. And so my mom, at towards the end of her life, my mother suffered with diabetes. And one of the things that she started to focus on in the latter part of her life is writing the oral history down and creating a family tree, starting with the proud Black African Papa Renty. That was something she had always hoped to do. But when she got older and her health began to fail, she started to put that responsibility on me. I want you to write these things down. I want you to make a family tree. And as she got sicker, it became more and more important to her. And towards the end of her life, I can tell you my last lucid conversation with my mother was of telling these stories and telling me to write it down. And so I made a promise to her that I would document the life and legacy of Papa Rinty, and I would put our family tree together. So my mom went to her glory believing this would happen. And so one of the problems I had is I knew absolutely nothing about genealogy, genealogical research, or even where to begin. And for context, this happened in 2010. My mom passed away in 2010. And at that time, the internet was not then what it is today. And to do this kind of genealogical work, you actually had to physically go to archives. And so I remembered being burdened by this promise I had made. And so one afternoon I was out walking and I happened to stop back. I was at work and I went out for a walk. On my way back to the office, I stopped into Rich's ice cream shop to pick up a salad. He also sold fresh fruits and vegetables there. But, and for whatever reason, Rich and I would always talk. We never really knew each other personally. We would just make small talk. But I shared with him about my mom's passing and my promise to her to do this genealogical research and to document the life and legacy of Papa Rinty, and that I knew nothing about any of this. And I was just terribly burdened by that because I had promised and I knew it was something I had to figure out, but I didn't know where to begin. And he said to me, write down what you know. I'd love to do this work. Let me take a shot at it. And so, I was grateful for the offer. Of course, I shared with him as much as I could in that moment. But then I remembered thinking, again, we're talking 2010. The internet was kind of a new thing, and most seniors at that time didn't really care to work on the internet, didn't really know how to navigate the internet, or even for that much turn on a computer. But Rich seemed to be different. He seemed to be excited about it. He says he loves doing it. So I wrote down what I knew. I gave him an important detail about Papa Rinty's African origin and some of the names of his children that I could recall. And he wrote it down, and I left the shop. I paid for my salad and I left the shop. I didn't go right back. I didn't go back to his shop probably for another week or two or some time. But when I walked in, he was standing behind the register and he says, where have you been? I found your Papa Rinty on the internet. And I was like, what is my Papa Rinty doing on the internet? So, I was confused. But what we did, at that time, we exchanged information. He gave me, I learned in that moment, his name was Rich Morrison. He gave me his name, his number, and his email, and I did the same. And he said, I'll email you the package that I put together for you. And so I thanked him and I walked out of the shop, but I really was kind of baffled as to what in the world he could have found on the internet about my enslaved ancestors. And I don't really go and look at it until later that evening, just before I was ready to go to bed. And so what I did was I said, let me take a look at what Rich has sent me. And I opened up a document that speaks to Harvard's premier scientist, Louis Agassiz, and his scientific racism and his scientific experiment on enslaved people to prove Black inferiority. And it was a real horror story. What I was reading shocked me. I had heard about some experiments on enslaved people, but never to this extent. And I was shocked. And what I learned was he traveled, the Harvard scientist, in cahoots with others, Boston politician and Southern politicians. He traveled to a Edge Hill plantation in Columbia, South Carolina, to see African-born enslaved people. It was important to him that he have African-born people because his assumption was, because of the intermingling of slaves and enslavers, that if a slave had any drop of white blood, that made them more superior than the others. So he wanted a pure African, a pure type. And at that time in 1850, there were very few that hadn't been touched by the violence of slavery. that could say that they were pure types. And so he traveled to the plantation of Benjamin Franklin Taylor, and he viewed a number of enslaved people, two of which, and I actually can point to, which I do in the book, allude to perhaps four of these people are my ancestors. And I explained that in the book, and I may have a chance to get to that later. But he does this experiment where he strips the enslaved people nude and points to features of the body, parts of the body, as stark different from white, and says that this is not of the same blood as us, and that these people can't be human. And he develops this race science, this pseudoscience that has been described by many historians. They describe Louis Agassiz as the father of scientific racism, the father of the eugenics movement, the father of apartheid, the father of medical apartheid. This is what historians have described this science as. That's not me, that's history. And so the irony of this, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is terrible. I close out of that document. I open an attachment, which happens to be a picture, a paparinti, one that I had never seen before. But when I opened that attachment, I was captivated. It was like this picture held me hostage. I stared at that image for probably a half hour, just looking at Rinty, looking in his eyes. And I felt when I looked at this image that he was communicating with me, that he was messaging me, that he was talking to me. There was so much familiarity in that image. I saw my elders, my mom's brothers, features that my mom helped carried. I saw so much that was familiar about that man's face, and I couldn't turn away from it. I just stared. And so ultimately I called my daughters and I said, you got to come see this. And my daughters came and they looked at it. And my daughters, for them, when they were young, as far back as they can remember, my mother told them these stories of Papa Rinty. So they were as informed about who this man was as I was. And we were just in disbelief. And when I say disbelief, because there was so much emotion that was running through me in that moment, because I thought of myself, a student of history. I graduated from college with a degree in history. I pursued history because I loved our family history and American history. And I'm thinking, how did I not see this image? Also, I'm thinking about my mother. If I had seen this image only 3 months sooner, I perhaps could have shown it to her. She never saw an image of Papa Rinty. And I know how much she would have loved and cherished an opportunity to see or to look in the eyes of the man that she had heard so much about. So I was so emotional looking at this. And then all of a sudden it hit me about the research that I had just read about the Harvard scientists traveling to South Carolina to the Taylor plantation. Rinty's name was Rinty Taylor, to do this scientific racist experiment. And I'm like, oh my God, no. Because again, my oral history was that my ancestor, particularly Papa Rinty, was a person of excellence, a symbol of Black excellence, that he was self-taught and that he taught himself to read, that he taught others to read, that he was a man of the cloth. He preached the Bible. He held Bible study sessions. He taught the Bible. So this was a person, a man, considering the time, 1850, when this was impossible for most. He excelled at this. So, for him to be used as a symbol of ignorance and inferiority was a mistake. If we could go to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, my daughter wrote a book. This is, and I share this picture for two reasons. First, to show that my daughter, how much he meant to my mother, to impress upon him that value on me and to my children. My daughter's very first book report was about Papa Rinty, and she entitled it From These Roots. And her dedication page, she wrote, this book is dedicated to my little sister so she can always know where she comes from. And I also have to credit my daughter for a lot of the graphics in the book. She created this graphic where she merged Rinty and Delia together in the backdrop of Africa. But always remember, was something we were always told, something my mother was always told, something her father was always told, her grandfather was always told. And this came from Papa Rinty. He wanted his children to always remember who they are and whose they are. Next slide, please. And so the other thing that I wanted to share as a part of the backstory, I, in doing this research, came to realize that Rinty was the symbol of all that was wrong with American chattel slavery. But what I later learned is not only is he the epitome of the Black resistance or the Black struggle or the struggle to acknowledge the tragic human suffering of slavery here in the United States, it is international. And so I received this message from someone and from the west coast of Africa who sent it to me. And he wanted to know, and in the caption is there, where he explains that in this part of Africa, children from all over come to a slave memorial and visit with Rinty. Not only do they visit, but they make a point of taking a selfie with Rinty. And so he said on this day, over 150 students traveled from all parts of Africa to the slave memorial to take an image of themselves with Papa Rinty. And he wanted me to see that, and he wanted me to know what Rinty meant to the people of Africa. Next. This is a woman, her name is Sasha Huber. And what she is from Helsinki, Finland, but she has waged an international campaign to change one of the tallest mountains in the world that is named after the Harvard scientist Agassiz Horn. She has petitioned the Swiss government. Louis Agassiz was born in Grindelwald, Switzerland. And the Swiss have elevated Louis Agassiz literally by naming one of the tallest mountains in the Swiss Alps on the north face after Agassiz. And Sasha has waged an international campaign with an international committee to change the name of that mountain from Louis Agassiz or Agassiz Horn to Rinty Horn. And she was successful in getting a stake, a part of the mountain that she could call Rinty Horn. So what she did was she chartered a helicopter and she flew to that space and she put the stake there, what she describes as she baptized that space Rinty Horn. Next. You see the image of Rinty in the background. So just to explain what you were looking at, again, social media is a beautiful thing. Someone sent this to me on social media and said to me, were you aware that Rinty was featured in Carnival in Brazil as one of the major floats for that year? I think it was 2022 or 2023. But Brazil is also a place where Louis Agassiz traveled to capture images of Brazilian people to point to the differences and again speak of this inferior race. And so Brazil also celebrates Rinty. as a symbol of Black resistance, a symbol of Black resilience, and is a symbol of all that was wrong with American chattel slavery. Next. So, after I learn all of these things and I learn about this horrible scientific experiment and I learn about how my ancestors were used and how they were exploited, and that these images were being held at Harvard's Peabody Museum, the daguerreotypes, Louis Agassiz's photography was a new medium in 1850. And what they would do, people would pose. And it wasn't just like snapping a picture. When you pose for a daguerreotype, it was a laborious, it was a grueling and laborious event where you would stand for hours just so to get the picture. And some people had to be propped up, as some of my enslaved ancestors were, to take these images. And the images were captured in on this copper plate. And those copper plates, those daguerreotypes were, well, I'll get to that, at Peabody Museum. And so I knew I had to reach out to Harvard and say, look, you got the wrong guy, because you or your scientist, Louis Agassiz, used Rinty as a symbol of Black inferiority. He was the exact opposite of that. He was a person of excellence. This is Rinty's rich oral history. This is who this man was, as opposed to leaving the narrative of Louis Agassiz to stand. Please correct the narrative and tell the true story of who my Papa Rinty was. And each time I reached out to Harvard, I got resistance or no response. So on this is an image of me where I visited the Peabody to see the daguerreotypes, to share I brought with me that day the documents of my genealogical research, what I had unearthed thus far at that point, to show the direct line from this man in the image to me. I presented it with them that day. They weren't interested in knowing who Rinty was. Next slide. So, as I continue to build on my research and continue to do the digging, the working with archivists, working with researchers, working with the Connecticut Historical Society, I also visited the Noah Webster House. Again, like I said earlier, one of the stories about my Papa Rinty was he'd learned to read and taught himself to read using Noah Webster's blueback speller. That was important. And that, I don't know if you have ever seen it or if you've ever visited the Noah Webster House. You can pick up a copy there. I encourage everyone who's interested to do so. And I say this for one reason. When I looked at that book, I was in awe of the accomplishments of my enslaved ancestors, because I knew that I, despite all of my education and my success in education, could not have taken that book and taught myself to read, not knowing how to read. So I say this for two reasons. To firstly acknowledge the accomplishments of enslaved people who did manage to teach themselves to read. That was not an easy feat. And also to say that historically we're taught that enslaved people were illiterate, that they didn't know how to read. And I challenge that narrative, because I know, as in my family, my ancestors could read. They could not advertise or shout from the rooftops that I'm literate and I can read and I teach people to read, because of the peril that they would be subjected to. But I would wager, based on my research and what I'm learning, that more enslaved people could read than history has told. And so I think that that's an important piece. And what is also important to note, the book that they used to do that was the Connecticut textbook pioneer, Noah Webster's book. And so I'm sharing these stories and I'm talking to reporters and I'm saying my enslaved ancestors are the subject of the Harvard daguerreotypes. Also unique about the Harvard daguerreotypes, they're the earliest known photos of identifiable enslaved people. So they have a unique historical value. So it's a unique history and a unique story. And so I'm sharing it with reporters. And what reporters do, they reach out to Harvard, and Harvard tells them, there's no way she can prove this. There's no way she can prove that our rentee is her rentee. And they discourage people from telling and writing the story. And so I would hear back from reporters who are saying, Harvard is saying there's no story here. We're not going to run the story. On this day, the image that you see before you now is an image taken at the state capitol. And the morning of this event, I happened to be on my way to work, but I saw in the news that they would be laying to rest finally an enslaved man by the name of Mr. Fortune, who was enslaved in Waterbury, Connecticut. He was owned by a doctor who, at Mr. Fortune's death, boiled the skin off his bones and preserved his skeleton for scientific purposes. And at the doctor's death, he donated the skeleton to the museum. Students visited the museum and learned the horrific story of Mr. Fortune and how his skeleton came to be at the museum. They started a writing campaign to the museum saying, give this man the dignity of a proper burial. And that story so resonated with me. I knew I needed to be there. I went to that event that morning, and I happened to sit next to this lady who turned out to be, I think, a history professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And her name was Dr. Gabrielle Foreman. And I was sharing with her the story of my Papa Renti and the fact that, Harvard is shutting down the stories. They're like catching and killing the story, and reporters aren't willing to write and tell the story. She takes me by the hand and she says, come, let's go to Mr. Fortune's casket and pray. So we do. And I'm standing there, and we are actually in that moment. I was praying. First, I prayed that Mr. Fortune's soul could finally rest in peace. And then secondly, I said, and God, send me a reporter who will have the courage to tell this story over Harvard's convictions and Harvard's objections. I opened my eyes, and there was a reporter taking our picture. And he said to me, his name was Rich Hartford, and he said, if you don't mind telling or sharing, what were you praying for? And I was like, a reporter. And we had no idea that he was there. We had stole away from the activity that was going on in the other part of the Capitol. And we went secretly and quietly there, and we were there by ourselves, but a reporter happened to see us and capture this moment. And so he asked what I prayed for, and I prayed for a reporter. And it was, I captioned this image, praying for a breakthrough, because when I opened my eyes, my prayers were answered. That reporter, Rich Hartford, got permission to do a feature story for the Hartford Courant. And not only was it well received, but it was picked up by the Associated Press and went viral. And so after this story, after this event, I didn't have trouble convincing reporters to tell the story. So it was really, it opened the door for people to tell the news story about Papa Renti. Next. So I'm continuing to do, Harvard is still saying she can never prove it. There's no way that she can prove that Renti is her ancestor. And so I just continue digging and digging and digging and piecing my family puzzle together. And I happened to find a woman named Rose Shiver on a site. It was a Lower County, Columbia, South Carolina genealogy group. I joined the group, and I started talking with Rose, who actually, turns out, was from Columbia, South Carolina, where Renti Taylor was enslaved, where Benjamin Franklin Taylor was enslaved. Not only was she from Columbia, but it turns out Rose also descended from the same plantation as my family, Benjamin Franklin Taylor. So I was like, oh my God, how amazing is this? Rose turns out to be a key feature in this story, and a key player in terms of the genealogical work and unearthing important documents. One thing that Rose, though, I'm telling her, at this point, I know that my enslaved ancestors, from the genealogical information that I had and from the probate records that I now had and the slave indexes that I now had, I knew that my enslaved ancestors were dispersed among Benjamin Franklin Taylor's children. So I needed to know where Benjamin Franklin Taylor's children landed so that I could find where my ancestors also ended up. So I said to her one afternoon, I need to find a descendant of Benjamin Franklin Taylor. And so Rose gets back to me with this man's information. That's Dr. Edmund Taylor, a descendant of the slaveholder Benjamin Franklin Taylor. I reach out to him. Actually, Rose finds his telephone number for me, and I call him. And it was a very bizarre moment, because when I called Dr. Taylor, I didn't know, firstly, what to say and how he would receive me. So I was a little nervous about that. His daughter answered the phone. She was a very sweet lady. She was very, very helpful. I told her that I was looking for a descendant. I was doing a family genealogy project, and I'm looking for a descendant of Benjamin Franklin Taylor so that I can find my family. And his daughter said, "You'd want to speak to my dad. He is 98 years old and hard of hearing, though." And I was like, oh my goodness. I did ultimately talk with Dr. Taylor, and he invited me to come to Columbia, South Carolina to spend the weekend with the family. And so I was like, I will be there. And I remember one of the things, and I write about this in the book as well, is just my children's reaction to that. They were very worried for me because I didn't know this man or his family. He didn't know me. They didn't know what I would be walking into, but I knew I had to go because he was the key to so much of the information that I needed. And I could tell from talking to him that he was like my mom. He was the keeper of his family history, just like my mom was the keeper of her family history. My mom knew everybody, everything, and Dr. Taylor was the same way. And he was a storyteller, just like my mom was. And he was an amazing person. Next slide. So I hope you can see the pictures. But when we visited, Dr. Taylor, the one thing, we sat down for lunch, and he made, or his wife made for us, a grit casserole with grits, eggs, cheese, and sausage. It was delicious. But at any rate, we sat down for lunch and we were talking. And one of the things he said was, "You're sitting at the table that was hand carved by the Taylor family carpenter, the enslaved holders carpenter. And you're eating from the enslaved holder Benjamin Franklin Taylor's dishes. This woodwork, these dishes are over almost 200 years old." So I was trapped in that moment. And the reason why, like I said, I had the Taylor family index of enslaved people and their wills. I knew that my ancestor, Prince Thompson, was named as the family carpenter. And so when he said that, I knew I was sitting in a chair that was hand carved almost 200 years ago by my ancestor, and sitting at the table. And I was just stuck in that moment because you can't really see from the pictures. They're a little blurry and they're small, but the mastery of the woodwork and the detail, and 200 years old, supporting me like I'm sitting in a chair that was just made a day ago. I was just amazed by that. And I mentioned to Dr. Taylor, I said, "Dr. Taylor, in Benjamin Franklin Taylor's will, it explains that my ancestor was the family carpenter and that I believe Prince Thompson carved this woodwork. Can I take pictures of it?" So we took pictures. And I also have here a picture at the bottom. On the bottom, you see two plants. They're yucca plants. We visited the enslaved burial ground where some of my enslaved ancestors are buried. And if you have not had a chance to visit an enslaved burial ground or see images, I invite you to do so, just so that you can understand the complete shock and horror I felt when I visited this space. It was a vast wasteland of swamp and weeds and overgrown brush. And in between the thicket of leaves and weeds and garbage and other things were these yucca plants. And what we were told when we visited was the yucca plants that we saw just a sea of were plants that were used by enslaved people as headstones or markers to mark the final resting place of their loved one. And I got the chills when I looked at the hills and saw all of those yucca plants. I just felt an enormous sense of waste and devaluing of Black life and the loss of Black life. I actually had to walk away because it was just so emotional. Next slide, please. And so this is an image of Noah Webster's blueback speller that I talked to you about. This is a page from that. I just share that to say it is not easy to teach yourself to read if you don't already know how to read. And you don't have an instructor or someone who does know how to read to teach you. And I again stress that to talk about the talent of an enslaved person to do that. And that's when I talk about my Papa Randy as a person of excellence, because he not only did that, he became a teacher himself and taught others. Next. This is another African American burial ground where some of my enslaved ancestors are buried in Mount Meigs, Montgomery, Alabama, in the Antioch Cemetery that was an extension of the Antioch Baptist Church. But just again, like I said, if you have not visited an enslaved burial ground, you need to take a look at just the horrors of the devaluing of Black life and the disrepair of this sacred space. Next. So
all of the photographs for the Getty series are appropriated images from other historical sources. Harvard threatened to sue me for the use of the first photograph that I showed you. So I thought, Harvard is going to sue me for using these images of Black people in their collection. The richest university in the world. I think that I don't have really a legal case, but maybe I have a moral case that could be made that might be really useful to carry out in public. And so after worrying about it and thinking about it, I called them up and I said, I think actually you're suing me would be a really good thing. You should. And we should have this conversation in court. I think it would be really instructive for any number of reasons, and certainly for artists that are really engaged in the act of appropriation who think that there's a larger story to tell.
So I included this clip because I wanted you to understand how Harvard ruled with an iron fist over the cultural property of my enslaved ancestors. This woman, Carrie Mae Weems, like many others who have talked about it and who have written about it, when you visit these daguerreotypes, when you go and see them, the inhumanity you feel moves people to tears. I've actually been told that they had tissue boxes set up there for the emotional and the visceral reaction people have when they see these images, the inhumanity of these images. And so this woman was so shocked by what she saw, she secretly photographed a copy of these images and came back to New York and hosted an exhibit that was entitled From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. And in doing that, when Harvard learned of this, they threatened to sue her for breaching the copyright agreements and the agreements that when you go to see them, you have to sign your life away. You sign all of these documents promising never to do this, this, and everything. But she was just so hurt by what she saw. She came back, she hosted, and she showed these images. She changed them somewhat, but she wanted people to see the inhumanity of this, and Harvard threatened to sue her. Ultimately, they didn't sue her. They purchased her images so that they could continue to control them, and continued. They dropped the lawsuit and purchased her images. Next. so one of the things that the Carrie Mae Weems story did for me, I had been to a conference in 2017 where Harvard had a international conference where they were talking about their ties to slavery, where they did not talk about their ties to slavery. And they used Rinty as the backdrop for this conference. He was the inspiration for this conference. But they did not tell Rinty's true story. They only celebrated Louis Agassiz. So I knew in that moment that Harvard was not negotiating or talking or working with me in good faith, that they weren't being honest to the press when they would say I couldn't prove it. I had asked them to sit down with me and review my genealogy so they can see the direct lineage from Rinty to me. They never would. I reached out to history professors. I reached out to Henry Gates. No one would respond. When I read about the Carrie Mae Weems case, and I also read a piece that an attorney wrote, Ixta Murray, where she wrote that one of the reasons why Harvard purchased the images and dropped the lawsuit against Carrie Mae Weems is there's a question as to whether or not they have good title of the daguerreotypes. She also talked about the public domain and things that are after a certain period when you have an artifact that is so old, it is no longer copyrighted, it goes into the public domain. The daguerreotypes are almost 200 years old. They are not copyrighted and copy protected. They should be in the public domain. And she also brings up the whole question of provenance and Harvard's claim of ownership and title, which she describes as murky. And so she goes on to explain a legal rationale as to why these daguerreotypes do not belong to Harvard, but should be given to the descendants of these people in the images. And so that was a big eye opener for me. That legal brief that she wrote really revealed not only, the question about Harvard's title, the question of provenance, and beyond that is the moral issue of whether or not, because of the violence associated with how these daguerreotypes were created, should the wrongdoer own those. And so I knew that I needed to speak with an attorney. I happened to be at a conference in New York at Al Sharpton's Criminal Justice Conference, where Ben Crump was the keynote speaker. And I was in a crowded room of over 400 people or more in the back. After hearing Ben speak, I knew I had to make my way through that crowded auditorium to get his attention. And I started to weave my way through the room as he was wrapping up, hoping that I would be close enough when he wrapped up to get his attention and also to get a selfie. But what I did was I had made a business card with Rinty's image on it, and I showed it to him. We're taking a selfie, and I'm fumbling with my camera, and I'm explaining to him about what Harvard has been doing with the cultural property of my ancestors, that this is plundered property, and I believe that this is a reparations case, and I need an attorney who is not intimidated by Harvard's enormous wealth. And so I gave him my business card, we exchanged cards, and we both went on our way. And I would say less than a week later, I get a call from him. He says, Miss Lanier, this is Attorney Ben Crump. He says, I haven't been able to think about anything else, anything other than our conversation. And he says, I believe that this is an important reparations case. And he said, what I need now is a Connecticut attorney, because I'm not licensed to practice in Connecticut or Massachusetts. And so, and the picture here is Ben Crump with Trayvon Martin's parents, Sabrina and Stacy, and they're on the film. Ben had a cameo role in the movie Marshall, which was written by the Connecticut attorney Michael Koskoff. Michael Koskoff happened to be on the set of the filming that day. And so Ben shares with Mike this story that I have shared with him, and he convinces Mike to come on as co-counsel. So I use this picture to show how, the forging of a dream team here and how it happened on a Hollywood set. I just think that that's so amazing. Next. So my attorneys get together and they file a lawsuit. And it was filed on March 20th of 2019. And the way Mike Koskoff framed it, he said that this lawsuit is going to knock Harvard back on its heels. And I encourage everyone who hasn't had an opportunity to read, it's poetry. The lawsuit reads like poetry. It reads like a novel as well. It is an emotional appeal to the courts. It's I call it poetry. It's just amazing. Mike Koskoff, during this time, also learns that he has cancer and that he doesn't have much time left. He has inoperable cancer. Mike spent most of his chemo treatments working on this complaint. Mike, while he was hospitalized, worked on this complaint. And I often say, Mike Koskoff did not have time to be sick because he was so engrossed in this complaint and he was so invested in what this complaint stood for. And he believed that it was so important because he believed it was a way of getting America to look at the harms that have been caused by American chattel slavery that is still endure even as of today. And so this was so very important to him. He put this before his illness and his health. And I shared it to say, just so that you understand the kind of man Mike Koskoff was. And the images, there was a student from Europe who actually put this together. The cartoon, he created a Rinty cartoon. And this is Mike and Ben and I, and the other images, Josh, myself, and Mike. And also when we filed, it was on the front page of the New York Times that day. Next. This is our press conference that we had in New York. Next. This is the Agassiz family. Harvard's argument that these daguerreotypes belong to Louis Agassiz, and that he gifted them to the Harvard Peabody Museum. The Louis Agassiz family came forward from all over the country. They pinned a letter to Harvard President Bacow at the time saying, give the daguerreotypes to the Lanier family. Harvard didn't respond. They didn't answer the letter. They didn't respond to the Agassiz family. But this is an image of Susanna and Marion Moore, who came with us. They came to Boston to present that letter to the Harvard president. And we had a small press conference, but Harvard never responded to the letter or them. Next. We filed the complaint. Our argument was simple. Harvard's argument, firstly, was that the photograph, irregardless of the violence, irregardless of the illegality of it, always belongs to the photographer, and that's settled law. I, as a probation officer, knew different because I had worked on too many child pornography cases, revenge porn cases, and kinds of where I knew victims had an interest. Our argument was when Harvard commissioned these daguerreotypes, they did it at a time when it was illegal in the state of Massachusetts. Therefore, what they did was a crime, and that the wrongdoer should never be rewarded with the fruits of their illegal act, that it must be returned to the victim or their heirs. We filed, we had a hearing in court, and the judge dismissed our case, agreeing with Harvard that irregardless of the violence, the photo always belongs to the photographer, and dismissed our case. Next.
State here in this case. I'm Attorney Ben Crump, and the fact that I stand before you as a free man and not a slave is a testament to someone's decision to change the course of human history. It is a testament to our legal system, a testament that was led by the courts here in Massachusetts when Chief Justice James Cushion in 1783 judicially abolished slavery in the Walker case. And it is the reason why he is so often quoted, even 250 years later, with the holding that the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our conduct and our Constitution. The second historical reference.
So when the lower courts dismissed our case, we filed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And that was the opening arguments you just heard from my attorney, Ben Crump. And Attorney Koskoff also spoke that day as well, Josh Koskoff. What you're going to see next is Harvard's opening. And one of the things that I want you, the reason why I show this, the parallel between the two is how the court, my attorney spoke uninterrupted. The Harvard attorney, throughout his entire presentation, couldn't even get a sentence out without the judge questioning them. And Harvard never really answers the question. But this is, again, the oral arguments before the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Here's Harvard. Next slide.
Litsky for Harvard, along with my colleague, Victoria Steinberg. I want to make clear at the outset that no one here disputes the grave evils of slavery or that Louis Agassiz's scientific theories of white supremacy were abhorrent. And certainly, no one here disputes that Renty and Delia were treated unconscionably, and it's more than clear that the daguerreotypes at issue were produced in utterly egregious circumstances.
What is Harvard's possessory interest in these daguerreotypes, and where does it stem from?
Well, so I don't think that question is clear from the answer to that question is clear from the complaint. They allege
So
that Harvard doesn't
why
have
doesn't this case go back to determine who has a superior right, as your opposing counsel has said?
Because the plaintiff's claims all turn on the proposition that she has a possessory interest or a property interest in these daguerreotypes. So it doesn't, Harvard's possessory interest as to the threshold question of whether she can bring these claims doesn't matter. It's, somebody can't, go ahead, I'm sorry, were you?
Oh, no, I'm just curious and listening.
Oh, okay,
attentively.
so somebody can't bring a conversion action to get damages or a plebiscite action to retrieve somebody else's property.
So
right?
you're
It doesn't matter whether it's Harvard's
maybe
or...
she's just called it the wrong thing. What we really need is an interpleader action to say whose rights are superior here.
Well, if she filed that kind of action, I don't think it would make a difference, because I think the threshold question is just whether there is a property interest in the subjects of a photograph. If the answer to that question...
Wait.
That's
Let's not frame it that way.
That's important, right? Because if what they're saying is, in these awful circumstances where you're performing, in the words of Mr. Crumpet, an illegitimate scientific racist experiment, should Harvard get to keep the pictures? I understand they've got some difficult arguments to make to explain their property interest, but your simple point that just because you're the photographer, you get to keep the picture, there are exceptions to that rule. If you kidnap somebody and take half-naked pictures of them, you don't get to keep the pictures. You take pictures of a child naked, that's a crime. You don't get to keep the pictures. So there are limits on your possessory interests if it arises out of criminal or tortious behavior, right?
Absolutely right.
So that was the argument, some of the arguments before the Supreme Judicial Court. And it took them 8 months to rule. And we go to the next slide. So the ruling, though I can't see this, but what the court did was they said, because Harvard had filed a motion to dismiss and it had been upheld by the lower court. The Supreme Judicial Court said this case can proceed, which is historic because no reparations case in the history of this country has ever survived a motion to dismiss. The Supreme Court also said, not only can it proceed, but we're going to allow you to enlarge your complaint to include a claim of extreme, outrageous, negligent, and reckless infliction of emotional distress for me and for my ancestors. Historic again. This has never happened before. The attorneys were over the moon excited about this. But the third thing they did was they said Harvard could keep the pictures, which blew me away because, as you just heard, I was sitting in the courtroom. I walked out feeling cautiously optimistic because they knew that Harvard, the whole question of provenance came up over and over. They knew that Harvard did not have good title. Harvard's answer was always that whether or not they have good title doesn't matter. I don't have title or a superior claim because my ancestors don't have a claim because they're the subject of photos, which didn't make sense to me. But nonetheless, the court ruled that they could keep the pictures. Next. So the news picked up, it went viral about the historicness of the ruling. Next. Chief Justice Budd, I'm going to put in and read this because she said something very, very profound. When she really chastised Harvard, the 91-page ruling was a stinging indictment of Harvard. Harvard's conduct thus belies its purported commitment to enable descendants to repair their histories, to tell their stories, or repair meaningfully the harm that it has done to them. So this was the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Next. Another Justice Cipher wrote a very, very stinging indictment of Harvard. Basically, she did not agree with the court that they should allow Harvard to maintain the daguerreotypes. Next. My book is published, and I think it's a tell-all from start to finish. Everything is in there, all the receipts, all the proof, and it's circulating, and I believe it is what motivated Harvard to do what you're going to see next. Before we go there, I wanted to say in my book, the last chapter, the last paragraph of the book is I explain to my mother. I'm talking to my mother where I say, I have kept my promise. I have written the book. I've done the genealogical research and I've written it down. And here, and I say in the book that when the book is published, the first thing I'm going to do is bring a copy and give it to my mother. This is an image of me and my grandson and my sister where we present my mom with her book. Next.
University will give up what are believed to be the earliest photographs of enslaved people. The 175-year-old pictures will now head to a museum of African-American history in South Carolina. Now, this is a part of a settlement with a woman who says she's a descendant of the people in the photos. Tamara Lanier identified one man as her great-great-grandfather, Renty, who she calls Papa Renty, and the images were first commissioned by Harvard biologist Louis Agassiz, whose theories on racial differences were used to support slavery in the U.S.
Descendants of Papa Renty and the descendants of Louis Agassiz coming together saying, we're better than this, America. We're better than this.
Now, Harvard released a statement saying, quote, Harvard has long been eager to place the images with another museum or other public institution to put them in the appropriate context and increase access to them for all Americans.
Okay, next. I included because Harvard, and they couldn't even be honest and fair, even in resolution, because this image here is just one of many images where Harvard has said that they plan to permanently keep the daguerreotypes. They said that in my hometown newspaper, and they've said that many times before. So their statement that we've always planned to give them up is not true. And here it is in their own words. Next. The other thing that Harvard said is that they're not prepared to confirm my genealogy. They've never looked at it. The one thing that is important to note, they have said in their filings and in court that they do not dispute my genealogy. So it would stand to reason if they had anything to suggest that I wasn't a descendant of Renty, they would have argued it in court. Next.
So Harvard wants proof that I don't know why they want it. I'm not sure why they want it if their view is you don't get it anyway. But is there some potential discovery rule issue related to the fact that Harvard's saying, show me you're the ancestor? It's very difficult for the reasons your opposing counsel say for a slave to prove their ancestry.
Right.
A former slave, a descendant to connect ancestry to a slave. So does that give them some tolling under the discovery rule because it's such a difficult question to establish ancestry?
So a few points. First, for purposes of this, I just want to make clear, maybe it's not responsive to your question, but for purposes of this proceeding, we're not disputing Ms. Lanier's descendancy.
Right, no, but I'm saying that Harvard made that an issue at one point, right? There's some back and forth between Ms. Lanier and Harvard about whether she's given proof of her ancestry, right?
There is some back and forth. There's a 2014, there's an article published in a newspaper in the plaintiff's hometown about the plaintiff in 2014. And
this was just to show that, in court, they argued that they're not disputing before the Supreme Judicial Court, that they weren't disputing my ancestry. But now that, in the court of public opinion, they want to make that an issue. Next. And I just put in this is the filing where they said they don't dispute my ancestry. Next.
I've been walking with my face turned to the sun. Weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Oh, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I have to run. I do what I can when I can, while I can for my people. While the clouds roll back and the stars fill the night, that's when I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. I can feel it in my bones. Early in the morning, before the sun begins to shine, we're gonna start moving towards that separating line. I'm wading through muddy waters. You know I got a made of mine. And I don't mind if I lose any blood on the way to salvation. And I'll fight with the strength that I got until I die. So I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. And I know what's around the bend might be hard to face 'cause I'm alone. And I just might fail, but Lord knows I'll try. Just as fill up the sky. Stand up, take we are going to a brand new home. Far across the river, can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home. Far across the river, do you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home. Far across the river, I hear freedom calling, calling me to answer. Gonna keep on keeping on. I can feel it in my bones. I go to prepare a place for you. I go to prepare a place for you. I go to prepare a place for you. I go to prepare a place for you.
Okay, so that's the presentation.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Tam. I really appreciate you being here and sharing this. Everyone, here is the book. Please go out and get it. It is a compelling and intriguing story of legacy. And again, our inheritance of resilience and determination to be treated like the human beings we are. I'm looking for any questions or comments that we may have for Miss Tammy Lanier. And if not, she and I can have a brief conversation. Tell us about this next generation that's sitting on your lap.
Woke up from his nap and he's fussy. I apologize.
Oh, no need to apologize. I think this is going to be a great tool for him later on in life to see how his legacy was presented to the world and the impact it is actually going to have. So I thank you so very much, Miss Tammy Lanier, for being with us. And again, everyone, From These Roots by Connecticut's own Tammy Lanier. And get it. Thank you so very much, everyone, for joining us. We are going to have another special occasion, Conversations at Noon, for next Wednesday. Talking with preservationist Brent Leggs about celebrating the legacies of African Americans through historic preservation. We're going to see why it's so important, but also how it can be done. And then Tuesday, August 26th, we have Jordan Freeman, The Fight to Set a People Free. Another Connecticut native, Kevin Johnson, will be bringing us that presentation. Thank you, everyone on social media, for joining us today. As always, we appreciate you supporting the programs and being with us here. Again, this will be seen on different social media platforms. We really appreciate you. Please let us know how we're doing. And let us know if you have any other questions or comments about today's program or any of our other programs that we've done. Again, let us know how we're doing. Let us know what else you would like to see. I am Tammy Denise, Outreach Director for the Connecticut Freedom Trail. Until the next time.